And Aubrey de Grey requires very little introduction because most of you have been back here chatting with him or being nearby to him and being like, that's him, that's him. So please join me in making whatever noise feels enthusiastic to you to welcome to the stage for the morning keynote experience, Aubrey de Grey. Yeah. Enjoy.
Right, that kind of works. I don't really need a microphone for this kind of size. That's good because this microphone's not working. Fine. All right. Okay, fine, yes. What? Fucking hell. Okay, I've been on stage like 10 seconds and someone is criticizing my appearance. All right. Well, that's, yeah, Maria, out of all of the people who work at SENS Research Foundation, is the one most entitled to do that because she has been on, she's the only person in the entire organization who has been on stage more than me during her life. Right, so I'm going to talk about longevity sticker shock. And you may or may not have heard that phrase. It's a phrase that I've introduced fairly recently as a kind of encapsulation of what I currently see as the biggest challenge that the longevity movement faces. So I'm going to give a bit of background. I know that, by and large, most of you know what I do. You know that I'm not in favor of aging. I'm trying to do something about it. And there's this organization, SENS Research Foundation, that has been created around my work and that Maria works for, Tanya used to work for. It's, we are making a difference to this. We are not making as much of a difference as we would like because we're not big enough. And that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. And the reason I'm going to be talking about it, the reason I decided to focus on that today, is because most of you already know the biology underlying what we do. You know, you've seen other talks that I've given and so on. I'm not going to give my standard talk to you guys. That would be an insult. So, let me go back to the beginning. 20-odd years ago, when I first had this horrific realization that hardly anyone in the entire world understood that aging was a bad thing, I realized pretty quickly that I had three problems to solve. The first problem that I had to solve when I switched fields from artificial intelligence, which is what I used to work in, was to figure out how to fix aging, an actual plan, the way that any kind of pioneering technologist has to think. The second problem I had was once I had a plan, I had to have the people. I have to have people who had the appropriate expertise to actually implement the plan. And of course, that might be pretty unusual people, world leaders in particular scientific fields. And then the third problem I had was to raise the money so that those people, once they were on board, would actually be able to get on with the job. Now, the first problem of figuring out an actual plan that would work took me a lot less time than I expected it to be perfectly honest. The big kind of eureka moment, for those of you who've read my book, Ending Aging, you'll know in the first chapter there's a brief description of this. It all really kind of came together suddenly in the summer of 2000, here in LA actually, or in Manhattan Beach, at a conference. Back then, I didn't travel so much, so I actually used to get jet lag, which I don't anymore. I was awake in the middle of the night, and I had this big inspiration that repairing the damage that the body does to itself throughout life might be a hell of a lot easier than tweaking our metabolism so that the damage is not created as rapidly as it naturally is. That latter approach, slowing down the creation of damage, was the approach that had dominated gerontology really since the beginning of gerontology, so for 100 years, really. Certainly for the 50 years since people started to come up with actual mechanistic, molecular, and cellular theories of aging. And, it was not going anywhere, and people had become very pessimistic, and I realized that actually repair was going to be better. And of course, that wasn't just the whole story. I fleshed that out very rapidly into a whole bunch of different approaches, which SENS Research Foundation is still following. But the point is, that was problem one, done. And it still is done. That concept, that general approach that I put forward there, and indeed most of the specifics of the approach, have very much stood the test of time and have become pretty orthodox now. I mean, I'm not saying that every gerontologist in the world agrees with me. That would be an overstatement. But what can be said, certainly, is that it is now respectable, it is now viewed as a perfectly promising approach to try to repair damage in a comprehensive way, whereas when I started putting this forward more than a decade ago, that was laughed at. So that's great. What about problem number two? Problem number two, the people. Well, actually, I was very heartened to find that that was an easy problem as well. I spent a lot of time going to a lot of conferences and getting integrated into lots of scientific communities, not just people who would call themselves gerontologists, and it worked. Essentially, people who are interested in aging, or even people who are interested in biology in general, understand that aging is glamorous, whether or not it's tractable. And so you come to someone with a scientifically robust, well-thought-out suggestion, and they tend to listen. They tend to say that would be cool. I don't know how many of you are actually in science, especially in science that is funded by the government or other peer-reviewed bodies, but let me tell you, it's no fun. It is absolute torture choosing what to work on, because every scientist with any kind of ambition has a list in their back pocket, a mile long, of things that they'd love to work on, but they don't even bother to apply for the money to do so, because they know damn well that it's going to be a waste of their time to apply, because the application is going to be turned down because it doesn't meet the feasibility criteria and such like of the funding body that they're applying to. So it's actually pretty easy to draw out the actual real ambition of high-flying scientists who are working on really boring things because they have to, because those are the things they get paid to do. So that's great. And by, I would say, certainly 2005, all of the areas of SENS that I needed to recruit people into were fully recruited. All of the world-leading professors I needed, they were totally hot to trot and on board. So for at least a decade, it's all been about problem number three, the funding, the getting the money in the door. Now, SENS Research Foundation has a budget these days of around $4 million each year. Even that pitiful amount is twice as much as it would be if it were not for my mother, who had the generosity to die 5 years ago and leave me a large amount of money, most of which I left to the foundation. It was very sad, but she didn't have too bad a time, and I'm sure she was very happy that that's what happened. Fact is, that money's about to run out because we chose to spend it over a period of 5 years, and so at this point, we are pretty desperate for money. It's crazy. Every day I talk to people and I tell them the situation, and they say, "What the fuck? How can this be so hard to fund?" And, I must say I agree. How can it be? But I'm going to tell you why it's so hard to fund and what you might be able to do to change that. And, of course, any billionaires in the audience, please see me later, right? But that's, that's kind of not what I'm going to tell you. So, what's it all about? What's the problem? Well, of course, everyone with financial resources is, in one way or another, an individual. They're all different. Every single person is different. So I'm not trying to generalize too strongly here. I'm going to give you a spectrum of the kinds of reasons people have for not giving money to SENS Research Foundation to get this work done faster. And actually, when I say faster, let me actually put a number on that. My current estimate is that we could probably go about 3 times faster if we had maybe 10 times more money. So even 10 times more money, that's what, $40, $50 million a year? That's still an absolute pittance compared to the amount that goes into medical research, even in the US, even in California, right? So it's pathetic. But still, yeah, 3 times faster would be what we could get if money were no object, and a 10-fold increase would essentially make that true. So, what's going on? Well, some people with money have the problem that they only have money because other people gave it to them. I already was fairly insulting about peer review. A few years ago, I actually wrote something for The Edge that spelt this out in more detail. But basically, peer review is kind of okay for the evaluation of scientific results, manuscripts and so on, but it is a complete catastrophe when it comes to determining the quality of grant applications. Absolutely catastrophic, because by virtue of the sources of the money, and therefore the parameters that are laid down, it is absolutely hardwired to be biased against two things. Number one, against cross-disciplinary work that combines fields that have not historically been very combined, because the people who are doing the peer review don't have the combination of expertise, so they're not going to understand what the applicant is saying. And number two, it's enormously biased against high-risk, high-reward work. It's all about success, because the people who evaluate the grants, their arse is on the line. They cover their asses by funding stuff that, even if it's really boring, is going to get published in a nice high-impact journal in the next few years. And so and they can get credit for doing that, whereas they will get the opposite of credit. They will get a kind of black mark in their reputation if they instead end up recommending the funding of work that ends up failing. And of course, high risk, high reward, that word risk actually means something. So, it's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. And that's why SENS Research Foundation does not predominantly seek funding from the government or from foundations that make their decisions on the basis of peer review. We instead work on the basis of philanthropy. So that's one big thing. But there's much more that stands in the way of funding this work. The second thing is that people are not sure that it's possible. They don't think of aging as something that is amenable to medical intervention. And this, I have to tell you, is mostly the fault of my colleagues. Not necessarily my colleagues today, but historically, in decades past, prominent gerontologists, I'm not talking about my colleagues in SENS Research Foundation, I mean other, right. The prominent gerontologists have historically tried, for self-serving reasons, to try to make their field, the biology of aging, seem more important by pretending that aging is this completely separate thing that has nothing to do with disease. Now, I'm going to let you into a secret here. Absolutely everyone who studies the biology of aging knows in their hearts that is bollocks. That actually there is no biologically meaningful distinction between aging itself on the one hand and the diseases of old age on the other hand. They are part and parcel of the same thing. It might be okay to call aging an uber disease that incorporates and encompasses all of the aspects of age-related ill health, the ones that we call diseases like Alzheimer's, and also the ones that we don't, like decline in function of the immune system. They're all part and parcel of the same phenomenon. And in particular, they're all side effects of being alive. What that means is that it's unbelievably, stupidly over-optimistic to suppose that we could develop a cure for example, Alzheimer's disease. Because Alzheimer's disease is not an infection, hello. It's a side effect of having been alive a long time. And so is atherosclerosis, and so is immunosenescence, and so is everything that predominantly affects people who have been alive for a long time. That means that almost all of the money that goes to trying to combat the diseases of old age is wasted, absolutely wasted, because it is being focused on the development of things that cannot exist, cures that eliminate the phenomenon from the body in the way that one might eliminate tuberculosis. No way will it ever work. And that, of course, is why geriatric medicine has made so little progress against the diseases of old age. But people don't get that. I have to get up on stage day in, day out talking to audiences unlike you, audiences who don't get any of this and who aren't really interested in the whole thing anyway, and to get them to understand that this is so misguided. So that's a big reason. People don't think it's possible. But now I'm going to come to the big reason. People don't think it's desirable. I'm sure that you've come across people like this, you know, curious people who say that aging might not be such a bad thing after all. It might be a, you know, blessing in disguise. And God only knows how I don't always actually maintain very good patience with such people, but normally I'm fairly charitable. That is, I kind of understand it from a psychological point of view. You know, most people are real cowards, and they don't want to get their hopes up. They've made their peace, excuse me, they've made their peace with aging. They just don't want to think about the idea of doing something about aging because they know that it's an uncertain future, and they would prefer not to, you know, reinvest any kind of emotional energy in that. They'd prefer to just say, okay, it's going to happen, I'll get on with the rest of my life and make the best of it. Which is, of course, bullshit, but that's what happens. So that's fair enough. And, of course, there are other reasons. You know, people, there's fear of the unknown. You know, people say, okay, the world's going to be terribly different when we don't have aging. You know, how are we going to pay the pensions? Well, fuck off. I mean, honestly, like, we're not going to have, why do we have pensions at all, anyway? Why do we pay people to do nothing from the age of 65? You all know the answer. It's because we're very sorry for them. And the reason we're very sorry for them is because they're about to die. And that's not going to be true anymore. Right. So, you know, we have to obviously renegotiate all these social contracts that we've built up on the basis that aging exists. But that's okay. You know, the Industrial Revolution was quite a change as well. But I don't see very many people who think it was a bad idea in retrospect. So, you know. All right. So you kind of knew all this. But I'm going to come to longevity sticker shock now, because I'm going to narrow down the way in which this subliminal fear of aging and the compulsion to defend aging and say that fixing it would not actually be such a good thing after all, the way that they actually manifest. Because everybody knows that they can't really make a rational case for that. Right? Everybody knows they don't want to get Alzheimer's and they don't want each other to get Alzheimer's. So ultimately, they've got to make some kind of extremely weird argument to make it stick. Okay, so what is the weird argument that people have? Well, it turns out that a lot of it revolves around longevity. So the first thing I want to tell you, which I think most of you kind of know, but I really want to get this stuck in your mind, is I don't work on longevity. SENS Research Foundation does not work on longevity, let alone immortality, whatever you may read in the papers, right? We work on health. We are interested in keeping people in a truly youthful state of health, both mental and physical, however long ago they were born. And that is all we do. Any longevity benefits that might occur, yes, they are definitely benefits, definitely, but they are a side effect. They are a side benefit of keeping people healthy. Of course, it's no surprise that it's a big side effect, because let's face it, what do you die of? What do people die of? They die of being sick, and we're going to stop them from being sick, right? So, yes, people will live longer, a lot longer, on average. But we don't work on that. Now, you might wonder, in that case, why people keep writing profiles on me and on our work with the word immortality in the title, and living forever and all that bullshit, right? Now, your first theory might be, well, maybe Aubrey has historically talked a lot about immortality and longevity, and only like in the past year or so he's tried to like wise up and be a little bit more politically correct. That turns out not to be true. If you go back to, for example, my TED Talk in 2005, it's identical. Right. It's just that journalists do not get paid by me. They get paid by people who sell papers. And therefore, their business is sensationalization. They do not give a flying fuck about whether what they're saying is actually accurate. They care about whether it's going to sell, and for sure, immortality sells. So that's a problem. But let me explain why it's such a problem. Because you guys don't have the faintest difficulty with immortality, right? With living a long time. And in fact, there are quite a lot of people out there, especially in this part of the world, who A, don't have a difficulty with immortality, and B, have a lot of money. So, what's the problem? Why don't I have some of that money? You may be thinking. So let me answer that question for you. You may think that being a billionaire is an easy life. You can choose what to spend your money on. But you would be wrong. Unfortunately, however much money you have, with very few exceptions, people who have a lot of money, they have other people that they know that they don't want to piss off. We actually have someone on our board of directors who used to give us a respectable amount of money. And he became slightly less wealthy in the crash in '08. And his wife said, right, no more of this bullshit. You know, I was only letting you give that ridiculous foundation $500,000 a year because it was pocket money to us then. It's not pocket money anymore, so stop. And he did. Bastard. He actually stopped giving us money. So, I mean, this is the kind of thing I have to contend with. It's not just spouses, of course. It's like, you know, trusted advisors, people who gave them the right advice that made them billionaires in the first place. They don't like to piss these people off, and that's a really annoying fact. Again, you know, it's not a good way to make decisions, and the people who are making those decisions know that it's not a good way. So it's not what they will tell you. You've probably noticed, those of you who are in business, who've got startups and so on, you've probably noticed that when someone gives you money, they're very happy to tell you why they gave you the money. But when someone doesn't give you money, they will never tell you anything about why they didn't give you the money. So it's a bit like that. You know, we have to read tea leaves a lot in order to understand how to refine our message. But a big, big thing that people use as justification for not giving money to SENS Research Foundation or other similar organizations, not that there are any very similar ones, is that they go back to the feasibility, which I mentioned earlier. They don't think it's going to work, or at least they say that they don't think it's going to work. Now, why would they say that? These are not biologists, these people. So, why would they say that? Obviously, they are basing their view, or at least their claimed view, on what other people say whom they have reason to believe to trust, right? So, what would those other people be? They would be other trained professional biologists, like me, but also with professorships at Harvard or whatever. Okay, so people with not only expertise, but credentials. If it is perceived that the expert consensus is that Aubrey de Grey is a nutcase, then you've got a nice reason to be nice to your wife and not give me money, right? So, the goal here is to fix that, to get people to view this whole thing as relatively mainstream. And this brings me to the real topic of today. The reason why most people, well, a lot of people who could give us a lot of money don't, is because a lot of credentialed gerontologists have historically denigrated this work. That's happening a lot less now, at least in public, but it's still somewhat happening. So why are my colleagues in gerontology so resistant, and why were they particularly resistant a decade ago? Fundamental answer is this thing that I've just told you at the beginning, longevity sticker shock. If you are following the traditional gerontology approach to combating aging, then what you're trying to do is slow down the rate at which the body creates damage in the body that eventually messes it up and stops it working. And the basis for that concept is very straightforward. It's that different species have different rates of damage accumulation, different rates of aging, different longevities, and so on. And indeed, even within a species, different individuals have somewhat different ones. Now, it makes sense to study that and try and understand it and try to emulate that and extrapolate from that to develop therapies. It's not worked at all, and there's hardly at all, and there's good reasons to understand why it hasn't worked. But here's the thing. Even even if it did work, it would only have the faintest chance of extending lifespan by maybe 10 or 20 years. Because what you're going to be doing is you're going to be starting these therapies in middle age. That's kind of a given, because people just don't like taking high-tech, new-fangled medicine for, 50 years before they get sick, right? You're going to start in middle age when you've already got most of the damage that's going to end up making you sick and killing you. So slowing down the creation of the incremental amount of extra damage isn't going to buy you very much. That's a big thing. Worse than that, you may think, well, okay, maybe things are going to improve over time. So supposing someone is 60, okay, and they're not going to be sick until they're 80. Okay, that's, round numbers, right? Now, supposing we develop therapies at the point that the person is 60, yeah, and they halve the rate at which damage is created, then that means that this person isn't actually going to get sick until they're 100. Sounds good, right? But they're going to be fairly sick by the time they're 80, because they're going to be biologically 70 at that point. You with me so far? I'm going to use a lot of numbers in the next minute, right? It's good, but it's not wonderful. They're going to be going downhill. Now, maybe by the time they're 80, you're going to have developed better therapies that make it possible to reduce the rate of damage creation by a factor of 3 relative to natural rates. So then you'll slow things down a bit more. But you can still see it's getting closer and closer to that threshold where people go downhill. Not good. That's where SENS comes in. SENS is all about repairing damage that's already been created. So if you take a 60-year-old and you do repair, it's a completely different story. The amount of damage that the body is carrying around is reduced, not just slowed down and further increased, but it's reduced. So you make the person biologically 30 or 40, just like that. That's the plan, right? And of course then, same thing's going to happen. Damage is going to carry on accumulating, and eventually the person is going to be biologically 60 or 70 again, because the damage, there's going to be gaps in the therapies. There's going to be things that the therapies don't quite repair completely. And so let's call it the more difficult damage is going to accumulate. And by the time that person is 90 and they're biologically 70 again, they're going to need better therapies. But hello, you've had 30 years to develop those better therapies, right? So actually, you're buying, essentially what I'm saying is you're buying time far, far more efficiently with a repair approach, a rejuvenation approach, than you are with a retardation approach, an approach that just slows down the creation of damage. And that is what led me, way back in 2000, to, some journalist from Holland, I think it was originally. He just wrote to me and said, how long do you think people are going to live who were born in the year 2100? And I thought this through for about 30 seconds and said, well, we're going to obviously not have aging anymore. So people are going to live an amount of time that corresponds to having the same risk of death per year that they have in young adulthood, let's say in the 20s. Now, let me tell you what that number is. It turns out that if you are in the Western world today lucky enough to reach your, let's say, 26th birthday, then you are almost certain to reach your 27th birthday. In fact, the chance of not doing so is less than 1 in 1,000. So, exponential decay, you can do all that, right? You're going to have a 4-digit lifespan on average, right? Now, so I said, well, at least 1,000. Let's factor in a little bit of improvement in risk of death from other causes, which I hadn't thought about at all at that point. And so I just added a factor of 5. And so I said, well, yeah, maybe 5,000. And everyone went completely fucking apeshit and ran away very fast. It was the number. That's what I call longevity sticker shock. What I was saying about the concept of rejuvenation, of damage repair, was quite controversial. I was bringing together a lot of new ideas from other areas of biology that had not come to the attention of gerontologists, and that was exciting and fascinating and intellectually stimulating and all those good things. But my colleagues in gerontology back in the early 2000s didn't pay the faintest attention to any of that, because they'd already run away very fast because they'd seen the bottom line, right? The longevity answer. And of course, the reason they saw it is because the journalists saw it. You know, it was about 03, 04 that I started coming to the attention of mainstream media. And of course, these people had the phone numbers of the grandees of gerontology and started calling them up and saying, hello, you know, this guy, he is mad, right? You know, of course, there was a lot of off-the-record ridicule, which led eventually to on-the-record ridicule, which was great because I could rebut it. But, you know, that was the problem. And the thing is, it's still the problem. It's not quite so much the problem now in gerontology, basically because I get so aggressive these days in saying, listen, fuckwits, I do not work on longevity, I work on health. But, you know, it's still really hard to get people to actually look away from the longevity headlines that keep surrounding this work. So, what does this all mean? What it means is that today there is, even though this has been going on for 15 years since I started putting these ideas out there is still a huge longevity sticker shock problem. It's less of a problem among the biologists now because they have been tortured by my work so long, and they've kind of been educated enough to understand that actually what I do is exactly what they do. But it's still a huge deal for people who want reasons not to give money to this work. People whose wives are not in favor of it, or whatever it is, right? We've got to fix that, or else this work is going to carry on going at least 3 times more slowly than it should, and an awful lot of lives are going to be lost. We've got to fix this, and we've got to fix it now. So, ideas. Some constructive suggestions from me, and then maybe some from you. The first thing we've got to do is to stop people from oversimplifying the message. So, most people are, of course, as we all know, constitutively unable to hold more than one idea in their head at the same time. But most people with PhDs are able to hold more than one idea in their head at the same time. They can probably manage, if they choose to understand the concept that the work that we are doing today is expected only to add maybe 30 years to healthy life, and therefore to total life. And that the only reason it's possible to talk about 4-digit lifespans is the longevity escape velocity concept, this iteratively improving the therapies and staying one step ahead of the problem. Those are 2 very separate ideas. The actual fact is that the first idea, the idea that regenerative medicine can truly repair aging comprehensively enough to give us 30 years of life, that's a scientifically unproven theory. It is unclear whether it's really true, and it's exciting to try and find out. The longevity escape velocity concept, the idea that once we've got those 30 years, we will be able to, to continue to kick the ball up the road and to stay one step ahead of the problem. That idea is about as incontrovertible as they come. If you look at anything that you might regard as some kind of metric, some kind of estimator of how rapidly we will improve these things, like the improvements in, let's say, powered flight following 1903, not before but after 1903, or anything like that, right? If you look at these things, it's like you'd have to go at least a couple of orders of magnitude more slowly than your typical technology does in order not to maintain longevity escape velocity. It is ridiculous to suppose that this would not happen. And yet, you wouldn't know that to talk to people. They think, oh, he's talking about longevity escape velocity, therefore he's mad, right? We've got to get people to fucking grow up and use their brains and understand that we're talking about 2 separate things here. One thing that's controversial but realistic, and another thing that's insanely hard to think about, for non-mathematicians anyway, but is inevitable. And if we get that through people's heads, then we will be able, I think, to get people to be a bit better at focusing on what we're really working on, the fact that we're working on health, and not on longevity for the sake of longevity. Now, why is that so important? Well, there's something that people also get wrong in thinking about this, in making excuses for aging. They commit what has actually been called the tithonus error. That's a term that was coined in the sociology literature because it's so common. Essentially, the tithonus error is an error. Thanks. 2 minutes, right? Yep. It's basically people are saying that the etymology is from a Greek myth of this guy who had to roll a ball up a hill a lot. No, that's right. That's a different guy. The guy who married a goddess. Anyway, he got old and didn't die because Zeus granted him immortality without granting him eternal health. And people think this way. They think that your typical person who is getting anti-aging medicine that works is going to stay alive in a state of health that is familiar today of people who were born a long time ago, people in their 80s or 90s or more. And of course, that's bullshit. That's not what we're doing at all. That's why I always talk about this side effect thing, the fact that we're keeping people alive by keeping them healthy. Now, if you get into this whole breaking down how we get to these long lifespans, that first of all we're fixing damage and then we're fixing it better, then, you know, even people with high school education can, if they're forced, understand that the tithonus error is an error. But until they do, they're going to say, oh my God, I wouldn't like to be old all that time. Right? That's what they're going to say. That's what they do say. I have to put up with this every day of my life. So yeah, these are the kinds of things that I want to get out there. Now, I've run out of time, so I'm not going to talk anymore. But I'm just going to say, you guys are advocates. You want stuff to happen. You want people to have a higher quality of life, a higher quantity of life. Hand up anyone in the room who does not know anyone who is wealthier than they are. Excellent. Right. So. So it's a trickle-up thing, right? I mean, there's an awful lot of wealthy. Thanks. There's an awful lot of wealthy people in this town and in this state, and we need to get to them, and we need to get to them fast. I want you guys to go out there and actually talk to people you know who are in a position to help. I mean, obviously help yourself as well. You know, we have a nice friendly donate button on our. But the point is, talk to people, advocate hard, advocate energetically. Get people to understand that what we're saying here is not crazy, and in fact that they are the crazy ones for rejecting it. Thank you very much.